Welcome to the new Jesse Wall Radio. We have transitioned to a new title to simplify our offerings. The Great Work Radio is now named Jesse Wall Radio. All of the pathways to accessing Jesse Wall Radio will remain the same as they were with the Great Work. This week's broadcast is an interview with British systems-based artist Susan Fynes. Susan Fynes' work is described as complex systems and patterns which emerge via repetitive methods that often in themselves become examples of a personal test of human endurance. Susan interests herself in the connection between thought and action. I hope you enjoy the interview, and please stay tuned at the end for new announcements. You seem to be able to create meaning and life with your art. And that's actually the first question I want to start off with is, do you think that you can create meaning with patterns? And can you also create life with those?
Certainly with the work that I produce, I tend to work, like you say, quite intricately. It's quite methodical, I'd say, as well. I would kind of, if I was going to categorize myself for people that aren't familiar with my work, I guess I would use the term abstract artist, and one of the key principles that sort of influences my work is process-led, and I use systems to create my work. I also have this balance of intuitive working methods alongside a self-imposed system which I follow. So there's a balance between the two. I'd say that pattern on an aesthetic level, I think can create meaning. People can sometimes relate to that. However, I think that because of quite often the large scale of the pieces, then there is, I think, an impact from, certainly from the feedback that I've had in terms of just the scale of time involved in creating a piece, and the dedication to that work, I think, does have an impact and does have meaning on a person, because really my work is largely at the moment about endurance, about physical and mental endurance as an artist, and the dedication time that we give to our work. And what does that mean in sort of this day and age? Is it actually a luxury to be able to do that? And
a luxury?
I think yeah. I think because everything's fast paced nowadays, isn't it? And I think everything, sort of quite often digitally produced, or, it's a very quick hit for a lot of people. I think so. For someone to spend, the large painting that I produced in the summer, which you'll be familiar with, called Visual Noise, that actually took 4 months to produce. And I think for somebody to spend that length of time on one painting is probably quite unusual to see. So yes, I think it does create meaning. I think it makes people question about what art actually is and what it can be, and what it says about the person behind the paintbrush as well.
And do you think that that people recognize a value in craft nowadays? I mean, obviously a lot of contemporary art or modern art or whatever we're going to call it is kind of slapdash and just thrown together, or literally trash or garbage, and anything that's qualitative in any way, is often dismissed as old fashioned. Have you encountered any of that? I never asked you that, and I never found out anything about whether you ever encountered any kind of opposition to your art because of that.
I've not really had opposition to my art in any way. Actually, I've been very lucky in that people want to look quite deeply into the work that I produce and why. But I think I have encountered people's opinions on what they see as art that's dipping into craft-based areas, and I think it is actually very much frowned upon. I think even today, people still have an opinion that art is in one realm and craft is in another. But slowly, I think the bridge is sort of is coming down, and I think people are recognising that actually fine art, as it stands today, can encompass many different media, and any artist can actually move between those as they see fit. So I think people in general are starting to have more of an open mind about how work is created. But yeah, I definitely think, certainly in the past, up till recently, people have been very much against dipping into anything that is classed as craft.
Well, it's interesting you say that because the whole arts and crafts movement was addressing that, and they were advocating for the division between fine art and crafts, or decorative arts rather.
Yeah.
They were advocating that that division be annihilated, right? And that was not just William Morrison arts and crafts, but it was also Art Nouveau was the same ethos.
Yeah. And I guess, I guess on a base level, what really was the crux of the matter was pieces or objects or whatever, ephemera, whatever it happened to be, literally being, rather than something with maybe a deeper meaning, it is literally something decorative that people would find joy from, that they would have in their home, rather than potentially a painting or a sculpture or a piece of art that was to induce contemplation of some, to some level. So I guess, that's the difference between, sort of interior design painting and maybe fine art painting.
But your art definitely induces contemplation, right?
Yes.
What is it you found? What kind of feedback have you gotten? What do people say it induces in them? What does it make them think of?
I definitely have people saying about, as I'm talking to you, I'm thinking back to the large painting that I produced in the summer called Visual Noise, which was probably the most monumental piece that I've created to date. That took 4 months. I think people, their general opinion of that one was first of surprise, I think, and they would want to get close to have a look at actually what the piece was composed of, and would be very surprised that actually it was created by somebody with a pencil and a paintbrush and essentially a roll of paper. So yes, I think people were very surprised. I think it's kind of, I've had people say that it was kind of awe-inspiring, that it was, touching upon the sublime, that because of the scale, I guess, as well. But I think the amount of time and energy that I think was put into that piece and hopefully comes out of that piece, people can sort of read into that. And I think that it does hit you, I think, with that particular painting.
Was your working method with that painting the same as it is with other paintings, or have you noticed an evolution?
Well, I do tend to work with systems. That one does have slightly more of a history, that it was based on one of my first sort of intuitive abstract paintings that I produced just after I'd had my twins, probably about 13 years ago. And so it was stemming back to a time then when everything was new and everything was quite raw and instinctive in terms of painting for me. And I always knew that I wanted to produce something on along those lines on a larger scale. But at the time, I just did not have the time to be able to, or the space to be able to do that. So then it was projecting forward to this moment in time where I could relive that moment and actually fulfill an ambition that I had all those years ago. So I think, that was quite a monumental task to create that piece.
So can you see like a growing in your operating method, in your work methods, where you're going from more basic to more complex, or is it like discipline? The discipline is increasing.
Both, I think. Yeah, I think the time scale, I think the patience and the dedication that I can, the time that I can commit to my artwork, it has increased, and I think maybe my patience has increased. That might have also come with age. I don't know. But I think also my working methods are becoming more and more refined. I think, I can see things more clearly. I can work generally quicker, and I think I like to keep my work fresh, and I like to keep my ideas fresh. So even though I work within systems, I'm constantly adapting and changing those systems with each new piece.
Yeah. Is your work symbolic of work itself?
Well, I've always thought of my work really as almost like a living, breathing sort of extension of myself, really. And I think with my paintings, it's more about capturing that moment in time, or moments in time, that it takes to create that piece. It's time from my own personal life that I have dedicated to that painting. That's time that I can never gain back again. That is something that I have devoted to that piece. And I think the repetition within the work is also like a meditative element to it, I guess. I have, dipped into Buddhist practice in the past, and I guess that the form of painting that I'm doing today almost replaces what you would consider to be a form of meditation.
Are you able to see life in your paintings, or sort of a movement in your own paintings when you look at your own paintings?
Yes, yeah, I think that's one of the comments that I have had about my paintings in the past, that there is an awful lot of movement in them. And I think most recently I'm working on a new body of work at the moment, which is revolving around text. And I'm sort of in the early stages at the moment, but it's looking quite static at the moment, which is something quite new, I think, within my work. However, I anticipate that when I actually produce some final pieces, they again probably will have a fair amount of movement in them. It just seems to be something that happens, actually. There's no overall outcome necessarily in my work, and that's one of the things I love, is the not knowing of what actually the piece is going to resemble or look like when it is completed. And I think quite often that is a representation of life itself, isn't it? Is we don't know what's around the corner, we don't know what's coming, mm-hmm. And sometimes the joy in life is actually the not knowing.
Has that been the case with all of your these complex works?
Yeah, I think certainly that's one of the joys of being a system-based artist is that you to a certain extent parameters are predetermined. So you would set a system, the conception of a painting, but you're unaware of actually what the overall impact or outcome will be. So that is one of the ways, I guess, of embracing the unexpected.
What are some other system-based artists that we could use as references or comparisons?
I'd say the one that springs to mind is James Hugonin. I mean, he is a British artist who I really admire his work greatly, actually, simply because of his dedication to his cause, to his art. He produces large-scale kind of grid format paintings that he spends a year on each painting, and they are very, very intricate, very meticulous, and he also produces very interesting, well, I consider to be very interesting documentation that supports each painting, almost a history of its creation, which, the books themselves, I call them books because there are a number of books, I would assume, for each painting, just because of the duration it takes, are categorised and systematised in quite an analytical way, with the interaction of colour, the placement of colour, the placement of pattern, if you want to call it pattern. He has a system which he sets up for each painting, like, for example, the length of the span of one of his hands, from where one colour will begin and one colour will end. I think there's some stuff online you can probably have a look at regarding his work. But he is very interesting, actually. He's a really interesting chap, and I think his techniques and his process are definitely something to be in awe of, I think, really.
Is his work illusionistic at all? In other words, does it end up with figurative results at all, or no?
No, it doesn't end up with figurative results. But what it does do, in similar way to people like Bridget Riley's, is an interplay of light within the work. So there's almost a vibration of colour when you stand back and look at his work. I mean, yeah. Different to Bridget Riley, her work is quite geometric, quite large scale sections or elements within each painting, compared to James Hugonin. I mean, James Hugonin, the pieces are almost like pixels. They're very small, mm-hmm. in comparison to Bridget. So when you step back from one of James's paintings, it is very... it's a different impact, I think, but you do get the vibration, the overall sort of impact of the merging of the colours, which I find quite interesting. There's a movement in his work, which I also like.
Is Chuck Close considered a systems artist? Because he obviously uses a similar method, but it results in, large photorealist paintings.
I would say he's probably a process-led artist. I mean, he does obviously use a system to create his work, but I'd say there's probably a large amount of thought through kind of methods of painting within each grid. For example, I'm thinking of his portraiture where he would divide it into a grid, and then there'd be multiple colours within each square. There'd be an element of having to carefully plan that to so when you stand back, the overall painting would emerge. So I would imagine there's quite an awful lot of actual thought process going in, and sort of careful rendering of what he's doing, rather than a way of detaching oneself and following the process that would dictate the outcome. I think he would know to a large extent what the painting would, what he wants it to look like before he begins.
So while we're on that subject, can you explain the difference between you say process versus systems art, or what were the terms? I'm sorry.
Yeah, well, it's a fine line. It is a tricky one, but I think we're using Chuck Close as an example. I think with his work, it's an overall stylistic way of creating a painting, shall we say? If we're talking about his portraits with the grid formation, which look fantastic. It's a great overall impact with his work. However, I think that he would have the ability to produce a number of paintings using that same format, but within each piece, he would be actively making decisions throughout that piece to render the portrait that he's trying to convey. Whereas I would say a process artist, that's a process artist, a systems-based artist, is setting a predetermined system before the actual painting begins, and following that system to create a painting.
Okay, so you become like an organic machine.
Yes, yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, you're sort of the system will determine the outcome of the painting.
But there's obviously a failure rate or whatever inherent in the process, because you are an organic person, right? So there's like always going to be variations that naturally occur. So it's almost like you're creating nature.
Yeah, and it's quite an interesting way of working, actually, because exactly for the reasons you've just said. And what I'm looking at the moment, it's funny. I was having a discussion with a group of artists yesterday, and one of the things that I'm looking at working on in the future, in the very near future, actually, is at what point does a system begin and what point does a system end within a painting? Do you have to see a system through to its ultimate final conclusion until the very last square is painted, for example?
Uh-huh.
Or actually, there's this balance that I'm interested in of intuitive working. So, my influence over a painting and the system's influence over a painting. And it's finding a balance between the two. And I think there's some really interesting interconnections between those that I really want to explore within my new work, alongside actually working simultaneously on a number of paintings. Because really, yeah, I mean, largely to date, I've been working focused on one painting at a time. But what I'd really like to do is actually work on a series of paintings simultaneously, to see how that actually affects my working methods.
Yeah, because you have a really strong focus, obviously. I mean, that's all too obvious. Yeah.
Yeah, and so I think some more. There's going to be a bit of a shake-up, I think, over the next couple of months.
Well, do you think that that's going to be beneficial, or is that kind of watering things down?
I think that any experimentation is beneficial, because I think we always learn something from what we attempt or try. And I think, when we get complacent, when things get comfortable, I think that's probably the time to stop painting. So for me, yeah. I'm constantly searching, and I'm constantly trying and experimenting and thinking, because that's where the excitement is really in my work. It's keeping it fresh and keeping it moving and searching for whatever it happens to be. So yes, but I do seriously have a thought in my mind that I will probably always be doing that. I don't think I'm ever going to get to the point where I think, aha, this is the painting style that I will always use, and this is who I am. I think it's, I think even famous artists have evolved over time, and they continue to do so.
Now, were you influenced by Rosie's paintings last year? That because she was obviously experimenting with I don't know what the word is, automatic. I mean, she wouldn't use the word automatic painting. In fact, I think she was opposed to it, but to something to that effect, where you just allow your body to paint the painting while you're meditating, so that it's as natural, supposedly as natural as could be possible, or Zen. Are you influenced by that? Is that part of the reason why you're considering kind of letting go a bit of the control this year?
I remember Rosie's paintings, actually. They were interesting. I remember her presentation as well. And I did find her working methods quite interesting, but I wouldn't necessarily say her work has influenced my own work. I think I appreciate what she was aiming for, but I think within my own work, I'm not quite as minimalist as the sort of the work that Rosie was producing and the methods in which she was using.
However, we're talking about Rosie Allen, just in case, just to clarify that.
I would say that I'm probably quite a lot more intense within my work.
Yeah.
And I'm also quite productive in terms of volume. When I'm in a working phase, shall we say, I will work really long hours. I will paint and paint and paint till sort of 3 a.m. And then I'll have periods between paintings where I kind of almost recuperate before I launch back into doing another series of paintings. And so when I do paint, it's like a frenzied kind of outpouring of painting, I would say. So I can imagine that my working style is very different to, for example, Rosie's, who seems incredibly...
Yeah, it seems like she's more focused on Zen. I don't know. I'm putting words in her mouth, but that's what I'm thinking. And then, but I think that there is a commonality in that. I'm assuming that you must reach a state of serious mental relaxation and like you said, meditation while you're painting. Doing that, it must be incredible. You must really zone out, right?
Well, you do, but I think actually it gives you a chance it forces you to be in the here and now, to be fully present in the task in hand, because there's an element of concentration and accuracy that is required within my paintings. And, I've said to people before, you can't escape yourself at all. There's no distractions from what's going on inside you. You can't sit in front of a painting for 4 months doing meticulous work and not actually completely reevaluate everything. It's so in terms of that, I would say it does provide a sanctuary almost for contemplation while I am producing the work.
And you have a studio, a really good studio apparently, right? And are you able to completely shut yourself off from the world? I mean, obviously you have a family and dogs and stuff, a dog and stuff like that, right? So how are you able to balance that?
Well, I have got a studio, but I do find actually that I work a lot from home simply because I do have twins who are they've just turned 14 actually. But what it allows me to do in the evenings, for example, once they're in bed, I can work, I can paint at home till 3 a.m. if I need to. I can, and while they're at school, I can paint during the day. That gives me the opportunity to then go to my studio. The advantage of my studio is that I can work on a large scale in my studio, and I can make mess, and I don't have the distraction of, children, dogs, people knocking on the door, the phone ringing, all of the normal things that we live with. Having a studio does give you the opportunity to shut yourself away. Although it is, where my studio is situated, it is in like a business premises where there are a number of other units. So you do get noise coming through from the other sides. But, nothing that a pair of earplugs can't cure, or some music, So yes, there's kind of pros and cons to both, I think, really.
Does pattern recognition have anything to do with your work? In other words, do you think that your paintings actually do in their final state, if they were infinitely applied to an infinitely sized canvas, would they actually start creating something recognizable, organic, living?
Well, my paintings are quite diverse, so I'm sort of visualizing a number of different paintings that I've got. It is possible, it is possible, but I think more than anything, you would probably notice some kind of rhythm, some kind of a vibration or
a pulsation.
Yeah. So I think that's probably what would strike. Certainly, I'm talking about this from my own perspective. That's something that I think I would probably pick up on. But I think in terms of people's desire for pattern recognition, that is kind of an instinctive response to formulate, sort of systematize what we see. And I think the mind will automatically attempt to do that in whatever we see. We will try to find common elements and patterns because we find comfort in the familiar. And so I think that the way in which we view things definitely comes into play when we're looking at pattern.
You must have had people say that they see different things in your paintings. What are some of the things you remember them saying? I'm assuming, of course.
Oh, well, actually, no. I think more than anything, people, it's the overall sort of emotional response they would have from viewing a painting, certainly a large scale painting. So I don't necessarily think that people feel it reminds them of a person, an object, or anything like that. I think more often than not, they might use terms like, I'm thinking of one of my paintings, it looks possibly slightly organic, but other times it might be that it reminds them, the colours might remind them of some kind of childhood memory that they have where they were in a house or there was a bedspread that had that colour on it and it takes them back. So there's all sorts of triggering sort of recall moments, I think, in anything we see that we can sort of find familiar.
Yeah, and you mentioned bedspread, and there are obvious correlations between your work and textile. What have you thought about that?
Well, I've actually been speaking to an artist fairly recently about he works in textile design, and he's supplied textiles to many different sort of London fashion houses and what have you in the past, and he's actually very interested in looking at my work and how that would translate to textile, to fabric.
Mm-hmm.
And it's it's something that I'm interested in. I guess I have always thought about that, and it's interesting you say that, Jessie, because I mean you haven't seen. Well, you may have seen actually online one of my recent paintings that I did just before Christmas, which does actually resemble kind of like one of the traditional patchwork quilts.
Is that on your Facebook page?
Yeah.
Where is that located? I'm not finding that. I see the latest, the one that you showed at the exhibition.
Fine artist, and it's one that I think I posted just before Christmas.
Susan, it's on Susan Smith Facebook.
Susan Fynes.
Oh, right here. Yeah. Oh, that's really good. Yeah.
Yeah. So it looks slightly reminiscent of a patchwork quilt.
Yeah.
So I'm considering different methods, different ways of actually displaying my paintings alongside other things. At the moment, it's kind of everything's in a state of sort of reconsideration. I'm not eliminating anything at this particular stage, and I think that's actually quite exciting. That for the end of the MA, which I finish in the summer, I don't know exactly what my final piece or pieces will be, but that is actually the way in which I work. I've come to terms with that,
yeah. And
I think part of what actually motivates me is the constant experimentation.
You're talking about the Masters of Fine Art at University of Brighton.
Yes. Yeah.
And so this is a piece. It was posted on November 30th, and it does look like a quilt, and it's multicolored, and it has boxes with crosses through them, right?
Yes. Yeah.
Had you shown anything similar to that before, or
no? That's a very new one, and this is part of a new body of work that I'm actually working on at the moment, revolving around text. And actually what I've done is essentially a form of coding within the painting.
Oh,
So
really?
the painting itself is sort of a grid format of sorts, and you'll see from that particular painting it's very colourful. And the reason for that is actually what I've done is I've replaced the letters of the alphabet with colours, and within the grid format I've actually used that particular one was a mantra, which has been repeated over and over within that space. So the letters are then represented by the colours.
And what's the mantra?
It's kind of more of a personal mantra, actually, which is, may you be well, may you be happy, may you be free from suffering. And I think it was quite appropriate at the time when I produced the work for many people around me, actually, that were going through very difficult times. And then obviously things you see happening in the world as well. It's one of those things that I think sometimes we need to be more mindful about, actually, other people around us.
And that actually did have a sort of Taoist ring to it in my ears anyway, the mantra. And you know what else? This is kind of what is this? An imposition on the piece, but it looks like it might have more concern with beauty than the previous work did, which was more, I would say, intellectual. Have you is that a possibility at all?
Well, I guess the aesthetic value, the beauty value is really in the eye of the beholder. It's probably in the eye of the viewer. And it's certainly not something that I set out to produce. What has changed in my work, I think, since the previous work that you've seen, Jessie, is that I'm actually working much more from my own emotional sources rather than from, for example, before I was working with scientists, like a particular professor of MRI imaging, and I'd had brain scans completed, and I'd used the brain scans and the systems and the colours used to interpret the brain scans to create paintings. And what I've done since then is I've been moving more into trusting my own feelings, emotions, intuition, still using systems, but actually they're sort of self-created rather than using something that's predetermined by somebody else that's already existing.
Now that sounds like it's like a balance that you're taking upon yourself to go from reason and rationality to feeling and, as you said, emotion, and that it's also going from one gender to the other as well. Representationally. How has this made you feel, this transition?
It's quite unsettling, I think, really, but in many ways I feel like I'm being much truer to myself, because I think any artist, when they produce work, really is what they produce is an extension of themselves. It's unique to them as a person, and it's capturing moments in time that they've devoted to that artwork. So I think that my work at the moment is, I think, much truer to who I am, and in some ways that's more difficult than actually dealing with data that you can dissect. Something that is a little bit more hard to pin down, I think, is a bit trickier to handle.
Do you this is probably a bit of a personal question, but do you feel that your mind is balanced between intellect and emotion, or rather between reason and feeling, or that you yourself are balanced, rather? Because the mind is obviously the intellect and the heart is classically thought of as feeling. So where does your energy reside? Was it residing previously more in the intellect, and now it's descending further into the heart?
I think I've always balanced both, actually. I think I've certainly attempted to balance both, but I think I had prior to the summer, when I was working with the MRI images and the sort of systems that are used by the sort of science professionals, I think that it became more of an analytical sort of role that I was taking. And I think naturally I'm quite analytical anyway, but what I'm doing is trying to shift my focus actually onto my interpretation of the world and the world around me, and actually focusing on the sort of uniqueness of any individual's experience of life. So if I'm taking myself as as the key within my own work, that is that's kind of quite a powerful thing to actually embrace. I think it's almost easier to use things around you than focus on ourselves.
So what exactly is it that you're focusing on?
Well, at the moment, I'm focusing on actually what motivates me to produce my work, how I'm feeling when I'm producing my work, how it affects me mentally, physically, emotionally. Particularly, I noticed that on the large painting that I did before the summer, the visual noise painting, that had numerous sort of impacts and effects, some that I'd predicted and some that I hadn't quite anticipated, actually. But it's quite an interesting experience, and I think that my paintings at the moment really are an experience. If I'm talking purely selfishly, as an artist, I think it's the most important aspect of my paintings for me is the production, is the time that I'm producing it. It's almost like once they're done, I can let go, but then I feel this void and this need to have another painting.
Yeah, I can empathize with that one. Yeah, I understand that, what you're saying. Now, obviously, in art school, everyone advocates that gender is a social construct. But in your own experience, what are your thoughts on that? And have you considered your art to be either feminine or masculine? Like I was talking about reason versus feeling. I've never heard you actually talk about that in class, and I never heard anybody ask you about that. So what is the situation with that?
What do I feel like my paintings have a gender?
Well, are you in touch with like a spirit, and does that spirit sway one way or the other?
I wouldn't go so far as to say I'm in touch with any spirits, but I'd say I guess probably the essence of who I am hopefully comes through in my paintings. And I don't know, maybe there is an element that says this is a woman that has painted this. But to be honest, I don't really overthink that kind of thing, because for me, I want to keep my paintings true to who I am. And I think if you overanalyze how people are going to react to the work that you produce, then sometimes that can deter you from producing it. So I think if you're true to yourself when you produce your work, then it's up to people really how they interpret.
I mean, that's really refreshing to hear, just because gender is pushed so hard in art school, And I've always considered myself basically balanced, in terms of the male and the female energies in my mind. And like they've done studies where supposedly the male mind thinks forward to back and back to front, and then the female mind supposedly thinks side to side. But I mean, obviously the most intelligent human mind would think in a sort of more spherical manner, encompassing the whole brain. And that's really what I'm trying to get at here. It's like, I do recognize something like that, like a balance basically in your work. And you say that you may be able to recognize that a woman did it. I'm not sure that that's entirely the case. I think you could actually, if you didn't know who made your pieces, you really couldn't necessarily tell whether it was a man or a woman who had created them.
I feel like that about paintings that I see that I really love, paintings that I might see in a gallery setting, or even just, in a book or online, wherever we happen to see a painting. If I love a painting, I love a painting, and I don't necessarily care whether it was a man or a woman that painted it. To me, that makes no difference, and that's kind of irrelevant. And I'd really hate to think that people would form an opinion on a piece of work based on gender. I think that's so outdated.
Then what is your stance, if you don't mind my asking? If you don't want to talk about it, that's fine. But what is your stance on feminism, and also on feminism in art school specifically, but feminism in general first? Feminism.
Well, I think as a subject, there's a lot of interest within sort of feminism, and I think to a certain extent, it's easy. I think there's a lot of subject matter, so in some ways it's an easy thing to jump on to use as source material for research, and as a backup for maybe some ways of thinking or creating work. But for me personally, I tend to sway away from from feminism. I just feel that I like to feel that I'm quite neutral. In general, I feel that I'm quite neutral with most things. I kind of like to sit on the fence about a lot of things.
I've felt that way my whole life, but when I was thrust into feminist environments in school, it really had a strong impact on me, as I think you're aware, and it was really, really, really hard for me. It was probably the hardest thing I've ever had to endure,
Yeah. Well, I think it's difficult actually when you get, you're throwing groups of people together. And I think there's this misconception sometimes that actually, certainly I've learned that, as adults or as mature students, we go to study and that everybody will be supportive and kind to each other. But it's not always the case, I think, as you probably discovered yourself. And that's actually quite disappointing for me, to think that grown human beings can not have evolved maybe as much as they should have done.
Yeah, and it's interesting because your twins are male and female, right? You have a boy and a girl twins. Yeah. So how have you thought about whether that's informed your work at all?
Yeah, I definitely think that they are on my mind an awful lot. I think, and the many ups and downs I think you go through with children, I think, both personally, but both, for them as well. You observe them growing and learning and making mistakes and, sort of pulling themselves through it and starting again. And I definitely think all of those emotions, you kind of, as a parent, you absorb those. You try to shield them and you try to protect them and you heal yourself at the same time. So I think those, if we're talking about emotions driving my work or influencing my work, then absolutely, it's definitely going to have an impact.
Could you give us an idea how we can see your work online, your website and Facebook page or whatever you would like us to see?
Sure, yeah. My website is Susan Fynes, which is Susan, SUSAN, and my surname is Fynes, FYNES, and that's .co.uk. So you should be able to find up-to-date pictures on there and hopefully blogs. There's also a link on that to my Twitter page. I have a Facebook fine artist page too, which I tend to post process pictures and things. If you're interested in seeing work before it's actually completed, I tend to put some process shots on there too. And that's Susan Fynes. Again, Fynes is spelled FYNES, _fine artist. So you should be able to find me on any of those three places, hopefully.
Thank you for listening to Hour 1 of Jesse Wall Radio's interview with artist Susan Fynes. Members can access Hour 2 of this show in the members archive at jessewall.com. If you haven't yet considered becoming a member of Jesse Wall Radio, please click on the subscribe link in the top navigation bar at jessewall.com, where you can register for access to the members archive, where both hours of all shows are available. Thanks again for listening to Jesse Wall Radio, where we keep on peering further and further behind the veil of esoteric iconology and symbolism, with a new show every week. Farewell until next time.